The hum of the earth was something Neil could always feel, even if he couldn't always hear it. From the moment he looked up as a child and saw the moon hanging silently in the sky, he knew there was something drawing him, not just emotionally, but physically, gravitationally, toward the cosmos. That invisible pull, the force that tethers everything from the oceans to the orbit of planets, would one day guide his path beyond Earth's surface. Tonight, it would take him to the moon. As the spacecraft lifted through the thickening blue, Neil sat quietly in the observation module, staring at the shrinking curve of the Earth. He wasn't alone. Technicians monitored data, lights blinked methodically, and the engines roared with contained violence. But in his mind, it was just him and the physics. Not equations, not numbers. The feeling of being moved. The feeling of falling towards something, not because it pulled harder, but because there was nothing resisting the fall anymore. This was gravity, always acting, never asking. Most people think of gravity as just what holds them to the ground, but Neil knew better. Gravity didn't just hold, it sculpted. It shaped galaxies, pulled light, and dictated the rise and fall of time itself. On Earth, gravity gave weight. On the moon, it would give perspective. The ascent smoothed as they reached low Earth orbit, and the engines quieted. Neil leaned forward, watching the Earth below spin gently beneath them. Gravity, though weaker up here, hadn't vanished. The ship was falling, perpetually around the planet, caught in a delicate dance where sideways motion counteracted the pull downward. Weightlessness wasn't the absence of gravity, it was the perfection of balance with it. He floated, gently pressing off the wall, the sensation both exhilarating and grounding in a paradoxical way. Earth receded behind them as the second burn initiated, this time to escape orbit and begin the trajectory to the moon. A precise, curving arc. Gravity still in command. As the days passed and the moon grew larger, Neil began reflecting on how gravitational pull changes not just by distance, but by mass. The moon, though smaller than Earth, had its own authority. Its gravity raised tides, shifted tectonic plates subtly, and even influenced the timing of biological rhythms in countless species. And here they were, on their way to its surface, responding to that quiet tug, like a pendulum finding its center. What fascinated him most wasn't just that gravity existed, but that it behaved consistently. It was predictable, universal. Einstein had shown it wasn't just a force, but a warping of space and time. The closer you came to a massive object, the more space bent, like a marble sinking into a rubber sheet. And in that curved space, objects followed the simplest paths they could. Curved lines in a curved world. The spacecraft adjusted its trajectory with a gentle course correction. Every nudge, every calculation was about dancing with gravity, not fighting it, but harmonizing with it. The moon, pale and quiet, was now close enough that it no longer looked like a disk, but a world. Neil floated to the window again, and this time he could see the gray craters in full clarity. He thought of how this barren rock held a sway strong enough to change oceans, to guide migrations, to inspire myths. It did all of this, not by reaching out and grabbing, but simply by existing. Mass creates gravity. Gravity creates structure, and from structure, everything else unfolds. They were entering lunar orbit now, a delicate maneuver that required slowing down just enough so the moon's gravity would capture them. The engines fired briefly, less violently this time, and the spacecraft fell into a graceful loop around the moon. The Earth was now a distant blue marble in the sky. The feeling was surreal, like standing between realities, between gravity wells. Neil knew this wasn't just a journey through space, but through understanding. Every moment was a lesson in motion, a dialogue between mass and distance, between velocity and attraction. The moon didn't pull harder as they approached. It simply allowed them to come closer, step by step, until they were caught in its subtle embrace. He pressed his palm against the cool window, watching shadows stretch across the lunar plains. Gravity had no voice, but its influence was everywhere, shaping the silence.
The lunar module detached smoothly, separating from the command ship with a gentle hiss and a slow drift. Neil floated in silence for a moment, watching the curved hull of the orbiter shrink behind him. The moon, fully in view through the forward panel, no longer looked like a distant neighbor. It was a destination, a textured, living map of history and force. Inside the cabin, each switch and display pulsed faintly. But Neil's mind wasn't on the machinery. It was on the way gravity shaped this very descent. Though the moon's gravity was weaker, just 1/6 of Earth's, it still needed to be respected. Too fast a descent, and they'd crash into the surface. Too slow, and they'd risk floating off course. The goal wasn't to fight gravity, but to work with it, to surrender just enough like a leaf gliding downward instead of falling. Outside, the gray landscape grew more detailed with every passing second. Craters, dust, jagged edges. Each feature was a result of ancient collisions, guided and accelerated by gravity. No atmosphere here meant no erosion, no wind or water to wear things down. What was created by gravitational violence remained almost untouched, fossilized in vacuum. Neil thought of how the moon had once been part of Earth, born from a colossal impact. That very collision had given Earth its tilt, its seasons, and even its stability over billions of years. Without the moon's gravitational partnership, life as we know it might never have emerged. Evolution had been shaped not just by biology, but by celestial mechanics. As the descent began, Neil watched the altitude readings shift. The engines fired briefly to slow the module, and the vessel tilted slightly forward. Beneath them, the Sea of Tranquility approached, a vast basalt plain where ancient lava had once flowed, now hardened into history. It had been chosen for its relative flatness, a kind of gravitational welcome mat. He felt it again, that subtle tension between falling and floating. Gravity was in control, but it wasn't a dictator. It was a partner in a dance that required precision, timing, and trust. The spacecraft adjusted its speed in increments, reading the moon's gravity like a musician reading a score. Every calculation was based on mass and distance, yet it all felt so natural, like listening to rhythm. Neil remembered how the same principles that guided their descent also governed galaxies. Stars orbited galactic centers for the same reasons the spacecraft now descended toward the moon: a balance of momentum and gravity. If you moved too slowly, you fell inward. Too fast, and you broke free. The universe was a story of balances, not stasis, but dynamic equilibrium. Closer now. The module's legs extended, casting faint shadows on the lunar surface. The dust below looked soft, but Neil knew better. It was razor-fine and jagged from billions of years of micrometeorite impacts. No atmosphere meant no smoothing, no forgiveness. Even here, gravity was both sculptor and historian. A small jolt rang through the cabin as retrothrusters fired again. This was the final stage. Altitude 100 feet, then 50, then 10. Neil's heart remained steady, focused. He'd spoken about this moment on Earth countless times, describing it to audiences, children, scholars. But now, gravity wasn't theoretical. It was a companion, a quiet voice saying, "You've come far, let me hold you." And then, contact. The landing pads kissed the surface with a soft compression. No bounce, no lurch, just the end of motion. The vessel settled, and inside, all movement ceased, except for the soft sound of instruments humming and breathing. Neil let out a slow breath. The silence outside was total. No air, no breeze, no birds, just the sound of gravity at rest, pulling gently at the module, at him. He was no longer falling. He had arrived. But even now, he knew the journey wasn't over. This wasn't just about reaching the moon. It was about understanding it. And understanding meant stepping out, walking across a world where every movement would be defined by new rules. The moon's gravity was weak, but it still shaped every step, every jump, every breath of effort. It was an invitation to relearn everything from the ground up, literally. He peered out the window once more. The shadows were sharper here, more defined, the light unforgiving. A stark beauty. He imagined what it must have felt like for the first humans who stood here, feeling their own mass reduced, but never gone. Even at 1/6 gravity, the pull remained. A reminder that no matter how far we travel, we are always bound to the Earth, to the moon, to the laws that govern everything. Gravity wasn't just a force. It was the stage on which all stories unfolded.
Opening the hatch was a ritual in itself. Each latch, each hiss of released pressure carried the weight of decades of human ambition. Neil moved slowly, not because he had to, but because he wanted to feel every moment. The moon was not a place to rush through. Its silence asked for reverence. As he descended the ladder, he felt his body respond to the shift in gravity. It wasn't just lighter. His muscles moved differently, as if his limbs had become instruments in a low-gravity symphony. Each movement had to be intentional. The sensation was somewhere between floating and falling, like walking inside a dream. His boots touched the lunar surface with a muted crunch. Dust rose lazily, drifting in slow arcs before settling back, undisturbed by wind or breeze. Here, gravity was a whisper compared to Earth's shout. But that whisper still held him, still connected him to the surface. He wasn't drifting away into space. He was anchored, just gently. He took his first steps, cautious but curious. The reduced gravity gave every stride an elastic rhythm, and soon he found his balance. With each step,
He could feel how mass still mattered. His body hadn't changed, only the force acting on it. He was still him, just in a different gravitational conversation. Beneath his feet, the dust told stories. Some particles had lain undisturbed for billions of years. Every crater, every ridge, every pebble was in its place because gravity had decided so. This landscape, though still, was the result of constant motion, asteroids falling, the moon cooling, tides shifting over eons. It was a gallery of frozen time, painted in gray and shadow. Neil picked up a small rock, no bigger than a fist. It was lighter than he expected, but not weightless. He turned it in his gloved hands, watching how slowly it tumbled before coming to rest. Even in this reduced gravity, mass dictated motion. The rock resisted change, obeying Newton's laws as faithfully here as on Earth. He let it drop. It fell slower than it would on Earth, but still it fell. No resistance from air, no fluttering or bounce, just a clean descent, straight and pure. It was a simple act, but profound. Even here, gravity ensured that what went up must come down, eventually. He looked toward the earth, now hanging low in the sky like a jewel suspended in black. From here, Earth looked delicate, almost vulnerable, and yet its gravitational field extended all the way to where he stood. It still held the moon in orbit. It still reached him. Even here, on this distant surface, Earth whispered its presence. Neil's thoughts drifted to how gravity connects everything, invisibly and unbreakably. When the moon was young, Earth's gravity had shaped its orbit, slowed its spin, and pulled it into tidal lock. That's why the same side of the moon always faces Earth, a gravitational embrace frozen in time. He turned slowly, surveying the horizon. The shadows stretched long and sharp, the sun low and unfiltered by atmosphere. The silence was absolute, the kind that didn't just surround you, it became part of you. Here, sound didn't travel, only movement, only mass and motion interacting in quiet harmony. And yet, he felt gravity in every step, every motion. It wasn't oppressive, it was supportive. It was the reason he didn't drift away with each breath. It grounded him in a place where nothing else could. Without it, there would be no shape, no orbit, no planets or stars. Gravity was the architecture of the cosmos. He paused and closed his eyes. He imagined what it would feel like if gravity suddenly vanished, not just here, but everywhere. The moon would drift away. The earth would lose its oceans, its atmosphere. Stars would unravel. Galaxies would dissolve. Without gravity, there would be no universe as we know it, just isolated chaos, disconnected and meaningless. He opened his eyes, grateful for the pool beneath his feet, for the silent force that gave form to thought, to life, to time. It was strange to realize that this subtle tug, this quiet pressure we take for granted every day, was the very reason we could exist at all. Back inside the module, he removed his helmet and sat quietly. His muscles ached in small ways, his joints slightly out of rhythm from the alien environment, but his mind was still on gravity, how it didn't just keep things grounded, but connected. As the dust settled outside, he understood something deeper. Gravity didn't need to be seen to be believed. It didn't need a voice to be heard. It only needed space, time, and presence. And in that, it shaped everything.
Sleep didn't come easily on the moon. Not because of discomfort, though there was that too, but because the mind had trouble settling in a place so utterly silent, so profoundly still. Neil lay in the small cot of the lunar module, staring at the curved interior, listening to the soft hiss of the oxygen system. His body, lighter and slower, still felt the echo of Earth's gravity deep in his muscles, like a phantom limb. What kept him awake wasn't just the alienness of the experience, but the thought that he was resting on a surface held in place by an ancient gravitational agreement. The moon and Earth had been locked in mutual orbit for over 4 billion years. Every phase, every eclipse, every tide was an outcome of that agreement. The balance was astonishing. The moon circled Earth at just the right distance to appear the same size in the sky as the sun, enabling perfect total eclipses, cosmic alignments born of gravity's patient choreography. He thought of the many moons in our solar system, some tiny and chaotic, others massive and active. Jupiter's Ganymede, Saturn's Titan, Neptune's Triton. Each one carried its own gravitational story, its own dance with its parent planet. And yet here he was, on Earth's moon, the one we know best, though we understand it least. So much of its surface was unexplored, untouched. So many questions buried beneath the dust. He floated the idea that gravity is not simply a downward force, it's a directional expression of space itself. Einstein had redefined it not as a pull, but as a curve. Massive objects distorted the fabric of space-time, and smaller ones followed the paths laid out for them. The moon didn't fall toward Earth because of some invisible rope. It followed the natural curve in the space Earth created. Turning to the small viewport again, he caught a glimpse of the stars beyond. They were steady, unblinking points, uninterrupted by atmosphere. On Earth, starlight twinkled due to the turbulence of air. Here, they were sharp and eternal. Gravity governed their brilliance too. Stars were born when gravity collapsed clouds of gas into cores hot enough for fusion. Without gravity, the cosmos would be dark. He imagined those same forces at work in reverse, black holes, the end game of gravity's infinite hunger, where a star's mass becomes so compact that not even light can escape, a gravitational pull so intense that space-time caves in on itself. From that extreme came gravitational waves, ripples that echo through the fabric of the universe when massive bodies collide. He remembered the day scientists first detected one, a whisper from two black holes merging 1 billion light-years away, a soundless shudder, traveling across space, confirming Einstein's vision a century after it was proposed. Back on the moon, those ideas felt closer, more immediate. Gravity wasn't some abstract equation. It was the reason his heartbeat slowed when he lay down, the reason his chest rose with each breath, the reason the dust outside stayed settled in place rather than floating off. It was here, even at 1/6 strength, guiding everything. He drifted to sleep at last, and when he awoke, the moon had rotated slightly beneath them. Time passed differently here, not because of clocks, but because of perception. A single lunar day lasted nearly a month. Sunrise would come slowly, and with it the shadows would shift with stark clarity, crawling inch by inch across the surface. Neil stepped outside again, his boots pressing shallow prints into the dust. They would remain there for thousands, maybe millions of years. With no wind, no rain, and almost no atmosphere, nothing would erase them. Gravity alone would keep them in place, holding that memory of movement long after the minds that made them were gone. He looked toward the horizon, toward the slow arc of sunlight beginning to stretch across the crater walls. Shadows retreated, revealing the bright contrast between exposed regolith and shadowed basin. There was beauty in the starkness, elegance in the stillness. The sun itself was just another actor in gravity's endless ballet, pulling on the moon, the earth, the other planets. Everything in orbit, everything in motion, everything falling endlessly. Neil gathered a few samples, placing them carefully into containment bags. Each rock, each grain of dust was a relic of gravity's work, formed by impact, cooled by time, held in place by the moon's quiet pull. Some of these particles predated the Earth. Some had been lifted into the air by ancient strikes and fallen again, settling gently as gravity tucked them back into the lunar bed. He felt the weight of that idea more than the rocks themselves. To hold something shaped by the fundamental forces of the universe, formed by collisions, moved by tides, waiting in silence. It was humbling. Awe wasn't just emotional. It was physical. You felt it in your chest, in your breath. It was gravity made personal.
There was a certain rhythm to movement on the moon, a slow, floating cadence that made even simple tasks feel ceremonial. Neil had adjusted now, his body adapting to the gentle pull beneath him. Each step required intention. Each lift of the foot had to be guided with care, not because it was difficult, but because it was different. Here, you couldn't rely on instinct trained under Earth's gravity. You had to relearn how to move, how to interact with the environment under this new gravitational constant. He turned toward a small slope not far from the landing site, marked by a shallow ridge and a scattering of rocks. The idea of climbing in low gravity might seem easier, but in truth, it posed its own challenges. Without friction from atmosphere or the full anchoring of weight, balance became a negotiation between momentum and mass. Still, he moved upward, leaning slightly forward, finding a rhythm in the resistance. From the top of the rise, the view changed. The curve of the moon stretched ahead, a pale canvas of ash and silver. The earth hovered low above the horizon, a fixed blue eye watching silently. That was home. That was the source of gravity that had shaped the moon's orbit, the tides, even human time itself. Months were named for the moon, after all. Calendars had long been tied to its cycles. This satellite, quiet and gray, was the timekeeper of human civilization. Neil thought about the paradox of gravity. It is the weakest of the fundamental forces, yet it dominates on cosmic scales. Electromagnetism is vastly stronger, as are the strong and weak nuclear forces. But gravity alone has infinite reach. It doesn't fade to zero. It pulls always, even across galaxies. It's the force that sculpts the universe's largest structures, galaxies swirling in clusters, filaments stretching across the cosmos. And yet this same force, so feeble between two pencils on a table, was what allowed planets to coalesce, stars to ignite, black holes to form. It worked patiently, invisibly, accumulating effects over time. A master
of slow persistence. He crouched and picked up a larger stone, a breccia, formed from fragments fused together under pressure. This particular one likely dates back billions of years, forged during a meteoric impact. That impact had been guided by gravitational trajectories set in motion long before the Earth even formed. One rock, an entire history of motion and attraction locked inside. Back at the module, he sealed the sample container, not just for science, but for what it symbolized. That rock had been shaped by the absence of air, but not by the absence of pull. It had remained still because the moon held it. Without gravity, nothing would remain. The universe would unravel into random scatter. He took a moment to sit near the base of the lander, resting his gloved hands on his knees. He looked around, truly looked. The silence, the light, the unchanging shadows. It felt ancient, untouched, and yet he knew that even now this place was moving. The moon was orbiting Earth. Earth was orbiting the sun. The sun was spiraling around the galaxy's center, and the galaxy itself was drifting in a cluster, pulled by unseen mass, dark matter, guided still by gravity's invisible hand. It made him think of how gravity doesn't ask to be noticed. It doesn't demand attention, but remove it and everything changes. Without gravity, atoms wouldn't form, stars wouldn't shine. Time, in the way Einstein envisioned it, would become meaningless, since gravity, by curving space, also curves time. Time passes more slowly near strong gravitational fields. It's a fact proven by satellites orbiting Earth. Their clocks tick faster than those on the ground, not by much, but enough that GPS systems must account for the difference. Even on the moon, Neil's heartbeat was just slightly ahead of Earth's rhythm. He was aging imperceptibly faster than those back home. Just one more reminder that gravity shapes not only space, but time itself. He stood up again, brushing the fine lunar dust from his suit. As he moved, he felt the gravity anew, not just as a downward force, but as a reminder of connection. Mass attracts mass. It's the simplest law in nature and the most profound. We are pulled toward everything, and everything is pulled toward us, from the smallest atom to the most distant galaxy. The moon was quiet, but it wasn't passive. It was an active participant in this gravitational narrative. Without it, Earth's tilt would wander chaotically. Seasons would falter. The tides would be weak or erratic. Life itself may never have emerged in the same way. Gravity wasn't just holding things down. It was building the conditions for life. Neil turned once more toward the Earth, still hovering in the sky like a memory. He could almost feel its pull, not just physically, but emotionally. That was where humans belonged. But understanding meant leaving. And only through leaving could he return with the knowledge of just how much the universe depends on that quiet, invisible force that gives everything shape.
The experiments they conducted on the lunar surface were deceptively simple. A hammer in one hand, a feather in the other, an homage to Galileo. Neil stood in full view of the cameras and released both objects at once. In the vacuum of space, with no air to interfere, the hammer and feather fell side by side and struck the ground together. It was a moment of profound elegance, the pure expression of gravity, unfiltered by drag or resistance. Mass doesn't matter when it comes to gravitational acceleration. Whether it's a pebble or a boulder, gravity pulls all objects equally, provided there's no medium to push against. This truth, known for centuries, felt different when witnessed in person. Not as a thought experiment, not as a demonstration in a classroom, but as a lived moment on another world. The moon's gravity, gentler though it was, still pulled with equal fairness. Later, Neil helped deploy a small retroreflector array on the surface, a device designed to reflect lasers sent from Earth. By measuring how long it took for the light to return, scientists could precisely determine the moon's distance down to the millimeter. Over the decades, they've confirmed that the moon is slowly drifting away from Earth at about 3.8 centimeters per year. It's a small number, but over millions of years, it reshapes the future. As the moon receded, Earth's rotation slows. Days lengthen. Tides change. This ongoing gravitational dialogue is not static, it's evolutionary. Gravity isn't just holding things in place, it's reshaping their futures through gentle, persistent influence. He stood back from the instrument and looked at the Earth again. The sight never grew less surreal. From here, it looked so calm, so unified. No borders, no lines, just a fragile blue sphere wrapped in thin wisps of cloud. And yet it was there that gravity first revealed itself to humankind, not as an abstract idea, but through falling apples, shifting oceans, the arc of cannonballs. It was the most ordinary and most extraordinary thing at once. Neil remembered how Isaac Newton had looked at the moon and realized it was falling, not crashing into Earth, but falling around it in a curved path, orbital motion as perpetual freefall. That realization changed everything. Newton connected the falling of an apple with the orbit of a moon. The same force, different scales. Einstein had taken it further, showing that gravity wasn't a force at all, not in the classical sense. It was geometry. Massive objects told space how to curve, and space told objects how to move. The moon moved not because something yanked it in a circle, but because it was gliding along a curved path through warped space-time. And Earth, in turn, moved along its own trajectory around the sun, bound by that same cosmic architecture. Neil could feel that curvature here, not in any visual way, but in the behavior of every action. The slow fall of objects, the way dust settled, the rhythm of motion. Everything obeyed the underlying structure of space. The instruments now in place would continue to gather data long after they departed, silent observers of a gravitational story still being written. Dust sensors, thermal gauges, seismic detectors, each device attuned to the subtle shifts beneath the surface, the echoes of impacts, the distant tug of Earth, even the tiny pull of the sun. It was easy to forget that the sun exerted gravity on the moon too. Even here, the solar tides on the moon were weaker than Earth's, but present nonetheless. The three bodies, Earth, Moon, and Sun, were in a complex gravitational conversation that unfolded over days, months, eons. Everything moved. Everything influenced everything else. And yet, there was order. The laws didn't change depending on location or time. The same equations that described the moon's orbit could describe the path of distant asteroids or the motion of satellites. Gravity was universal, impartial, deeply fair. As Neil walked back toward the lander, the horizon seemed closer than on Earth. The moon's smaller size meant its curve was more noticeable. It reminded him that this was not just a different place, but a different kind of world. Here, the rules played out on a smaller scale, but no less profoundly. The path he left behind was still visible, soft, deliberate prints stretching across untouched soil. No wind would erase them. No rain would smooth them away. They would remain, preserved by the very gravity that placed them there. As he paused one last time before re-entering the module, he realized something simple but overwhelming. The moon didn't feel distant anymore. It felt connected, not just through science, but through the shared language of motion, a language written by gravity. Every orbit, every step, every falling feather, it all spoke the same truth.
Inside the module once again, the narrow cabin felt familiar now, almost comfortable. Neil moved with practiced ease in the reduced gravity, navigating the switches and controls, checking pressure readouts and oxygen levels. But his attention wasn't on the instruments. It was still outside, on the surface they'd soon leave behind. The moon had taught him something subtle, something that no textbook or formula could fully convey. Gravity, in its quiet insistence, revealed truths not just about the universe, but about presence, about belonging. He took a moment to stare through the small viewport again. The sun had risen higher, casting shorter, sharper shadows across the craters. The stark contrasts painted the landscape with a kind of alien clarity. In that light, each ridge and valley seemed to declare its origin, a collision, a collapse, a pressure point of ancient force. And beneath it all, gravity had been the silent artist, guiding the brushstroke of impact and time. He reflected on the way gravity works not just vertically, but relationally. It exists between objects, not in them. There's no such thing as gravity in isolation. It arises between mass and mass in the invisible field where space becomes curved. It's not an internal property like temperature or charge. It's a conversation, not a monologue. And that conversation never ends. Even in sleep, Earth and Moon continue their orbit, locked in a rhythm choreographed by invisible hands. Earth's oceans rise and fall in response. The Earth itself deforms slightly, pulled into an oval by the Moon's persistent tug. The crust shifts, the magma flows. Gravity moves continents over geologic time. He remembered something that often gets overlooked. Gravity doesn't pull straight down. It pulls toward the center of mass. When you stand on the side of a hill, gravity is pulling you toward the core of the moon or of the Earth along a vector invisible to the eye. Down is always toward the middle. What we feel as down is actually inward. We live and walk and build on the surface of a sphere. Every direction of gravity is curved, radial, always seeking the center. That realization made him think about black holes again, those strange places where the center becomes unreachable, where gravity overwhelms all other forces, where even light can't find a path out. Black holes don't just trap matter, they trap direction, they trap time. Their pull is so extreme that space around them is permanently bent inward, and once you pass a certain point, escape becomes impossible. Here, on the moon, gravity was weak, almost playful, but it reminded him that strength isn't what makes gravity powerful, it's constancy. The moon didn't yank on him, it held him gently. It gave him permission to stay. And when it was time, it would let him go again. No resistance, just the invisible pull of mass calling mass. The clocks ticked forward. Departure was approaching. He began to prepare the cabin, initiating the startup sequence. Outside, the lunar surface remained unchanged. The prints, the tools, the discarded equipment, it would all stay behind, like a museum display under vacuum, a still life of human effort in a landscape shaped by nothing more than dust and pull. He floated for a moment, holding a handrail, his body swaying slowly as the module systems hummed back to life. He imagined the return, leaving this small world behind, falling back toward Earth not in free flight, but in a careful, continuous fall. Escape velocity wasn't about defying gravity, it was about giving gravity something else to work with: motion. Give an object the right speed, the right direction, and gravity becomes a path, not a prison. As the module rose from the moon's surface, he'd feel the transition again, not a break, but a change in influence. First the moon, then Earth, then the sun, each body exerting its authority, each playing a part in the route home. The moon wouldn't hold them longer. Their momentum, precisely calculated, would do the work. And yet, it was gravity that guided those calculations. It was always gravity. He reached for a small container on the wall, a rock sample sealed in glass. Holding it gently, he turned it in the light. Inside that fragment was a timeline far older than humanity, older than continents, maybe even older than Earth. It had formed when the moon's surface was molten, shaped by impacts, cooled in silence, and rested in place under gravity's quiet care. Now it was going home with him, not because it wanted to, but because humans had learned to ride the curves of space, had learned to listen to the pull rather than resist it. That piece of rock would sit in a lab, be studied, catalogued, debated. But it would also be proof that we could leave Earth, stand on another world, and come back again. And through it all, gravity had been the thread. Unseen, unfelt in the moment, but always present.
The engines would fire soon. Neil could already feel the shift in the cabin, subtle but unmistakable. Final system checks were complete, and the guidance computer had plotted the return trajectory with mathematical precision. Yet beyond the blinking lights and diagnostic confirmations, he felt a quiet pause settled over him. One last moment to absorb where he was before gravity once again changed its allegiance. He looked down at the lunar surface, now soon to be beneath him once more. For a moment, it was as if the moon knew, as if it had offered a brief loan of gravity, just enough to walk, to learn, to gather, but not to stay. The moon doesn't cling. It pulls just enough to give shape and time, then lets go. That's the thing about gravity. It's not a trap. It's a negotiation. Objects stay where they are because the forces acting upon them are in balance. Take away friction, and orbits become endless dances. Change one parameter, and the whole system adapts. Gravity doesn't force obedience. It persuades with mass and motion. The countdown began, and Neil braced himself. The thrusters would initiate a slow burn to lift the module off the moon's surface and into rendezvous with the command ship still orbiting above. The motion wouldn't be sudden. It would be deliberate. In low gravity, the need for brute force is lessened. Precision becomes the power. He thought of how on Earth rockets must roar against the crushing pull of our home planet, breaking free from a deep well of gravitational influence. But here, it would take only a fraction of that effort. Still, it required mastery. Even the lightest pull, if misread,
could send them tumbling in the wrong direction, lost to space. The engines fired, a low vibration rattling through the module. Dust kicked up in a slow-motion wave, dancing for a final time before settling once again into stillness. The lander lifted, weightless for a second, before climbing in a steady, graceful arc. Below, the moon began to fall away, not because it moved, but because they did. A departure, not of rejection, but of gravitational transition. Neil leaned slightly toward the window, watching the horizon drop. The shadows shifted, and the pale surface began to shrink. His body felt the transition too, a new state of fall, not downward, but outward. They were no longer held by the moon alone. They were between worlds now. It was a strange feeling being in transit between two gravitational bodies. In that space, there's no true center. You are guided not by a single pull, but by a composite of many. The Earth's influence grows stronger as distance from the moon increases. The gravitational baton is passed without ceremony, but with exacting grace. As the spacecraft cleared the immediate influence of the moon, Neil began recalibrating his internal sense of place. On Earth, we take gravity for granted. It grounds our emotions, our language, even our identity. Falling in love, weighing the consequences, carrying the burden, all metaphors rooted in the physics of attraction. But here, beyond the pull of one world, and not yet within the full embrace of another, he felt untethered, not lost, just free of assumption. And yet, the Earth waited, its pull now unmistakable. Even without looking, Neil could feel it, a magnetic longing, an ancient reminder of origin. They weren't falling toward home. Home was reaching out, ever so gently, guiding their return. In the command module, as the two crafts docked, the transition from lunar module to orbiter felt like climbing back into the familiar after walking through a dream. The instruments, the control panels, the seat restraints, everything had purpose. Everything was designed for this moment. Gravity's influence had shifted again. They were now aligned with Earth's curved path. Neil strapped in, securing himself with calm, practiced hands. Outside, the moon grew smaller, its surface now fully bathed in light. It wasn't goodbye. It was more like a nod, a silent agreement that they would meet again. After all, Earth and Moon are bound forever. Their gravitational tether may stretch and change, but it never breaks. He closed his eyes for a moment, floating in the soft cradle of motion. Between here and Earth, there would be time to think, time to remember, time to feel the strange truth of what they'd just experienced. On the moon, they had felt lighter, but never empty. They had moved slower, but never stopped. Gravity, even in weakness, had held them close, and then let them go. That was its nature. The return journey had a different flavor of silence. In the void between the moon and the Earth, there was no surface beneath their feet, nor horizon to reference. The stars outside seemed unmoving, eternal pinpoints on a black canvas, yet everything was in motion. Neil floated gently in the command module, his body weightless, his thoughts anchored to the quiet hum of trajectory correction burns and telemetry readouts. He understood now, more deeply than ever, that falling and orbiting were the same thing. They weren't on a path being held up by engines or wings. They were falling around Earth, perpetually missing it. Gravity wasn't dragging them down. It was shaping their motion, curving space under their feet, and making sure that every movement followed a larger, older rule. This was what Einstein had meant, that gravity was the geometry of space-time itself. The Earth, with its massive presence, bent the invisible fabric of the universe, and their ship, even in apparent silence and emptiness, was riding that curve like a marble on a warped sheet. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was true. Neil thought about how everything they did, every correction, every thrust, was a dialogue with gravity. Nothing was random. Each movement had to anticipate the invisible slopes carved out by mass. The spacecraft wasn't just traveling, it was cooperating with a map they couldn't see but could measure, predict, and navigate. He floated toward the window again and finally saw Earth in full. Not a marble now, but a living planet, rotating slowly, wrapped in blue and white. From here, it looked peaceful. It looked unified. You couldn't see conflict or division from orbit. You saw systems, cloud patterns spinning over oceans, continents glowing in soft twilight, polar caps reflecting sunlight. And beneath all of it, gravity worked without recognition. It held the oceans to the surface, gave shape to weather, carved rivers, raised mountains. It kept the atmosphere from bleeding into space. It pulled raindrops downward and held children in the arms of their parents. Everything that moved on Earth did so under gravity's gentle pressure. Neil thought of all the things gravity made possible on Earth that we never even notice, like the way trees grow upward against it, reaching for light, or how tides follow the dance of the moon, drawing coastlines in and out like breath. He remembered the astronauts who studied the effects of zero gravity on the human body, how bones thinned, muscles weakened, fluid shifted. Without gravity, even the body forgot how to be itself. They were now well into the Earth's gravitational influence. The onboard systems began to account for orbital insertion. The speed, the angle, the atmosphere, all had to be just right. Too shallow, and they'd skip off like a stone on water. Too steep, and the heat of re-entry could overwhelm the shield. Gravity, once again, was not just a pull, it was a demand for precision. Neil thought about the idea of escape velocity, the speed needed to break free of a gravitational field. On Earth, that speed is over 11 kilometers per second, an immense force, a defiance of billions of tons of planetary mass. But escape doesn't mean absence of gravity. It means reaching a place where the pull can no longer bend your path inward. Even here, far above the surface, they were not beyond Earth's gravity. They were still falling, just forward fast enough to keep missing the planet until the descent was intentional. He smiled at the irony. People thought of space as weightlessness, but that wasn't quite right. You weren't weightless because gravity was gone. You were weightless because you were constantly falling with nothing to stop you. It was motion in perfect harmony with curvature. It was surrendering to gravity, not escaping it. Through the window, the Earth grew brighter. The sun caught the curve of the atmosphere, painting it in a halo of blues and golds. Soon they would begin the final burn to slow the ship and guide it into re-entry. The protective layers would glow, the heat shield would absorb the fury, and gravity would reclaim them. And then, beneath all of that, beneath the physics, the heat, the descent, would be the simplest truth. They were coming home because Earth was calling them. Not loudly, but persistently. Not forcefully, but with familiarity. It had pulled them from the beginning. From the moment they launched, from the first step on the moon, even now. Gravity didn't forget.
Re-entry was not subtle. It never is. As the spacecraft began to pierce the upper atmosphere, the silence gave way to pressure. The heat shield flared with incandescent intensity. The air outside compressed and roared, and for the first time in days, gravity began to feel like weight again. Not the gentle, ghost-like pull of the moon, not the measured drift of orbital inertia. This was Earth's full embrace, dense, assertive, immediate. Neil felt the shift in his body as deceleration pressed him into his seat, a firm reminder that home was not just a direction, but a force. The spacecraft's angle had to be exact. Too shallow, and they would bounce off the atmosphere like a stone skipping across water. Too steep, and the descent would become a plunge, unforgiving and deadly. But this path, this narrow corridor of survival, was gravity's design. It wasn't a punishment. It was precision. It was law. Outside, the plasma trail lit the sky in colors they couldn't see from within. Fiery oranges, deep reds, and ultraviolet flames dancing along the friction-borne envelope of superheated gas. They weren't burning through the atmosphere. They were compressing it, folding it under their motion, converting kinetic energy into light and heat. Neil watched the altimeter spin backward, the numbers tumbling toward familiar terrain. His body was heavy again, each breath more labored, each movement a negotiation. After days of drifting, it was almost disorienting to feel held so tightly by a planet. And yet it was comforting. Earth's gravity was like gravity remembered, gravity personalized. The parachutes deployed high above the ocean, jolting the cabin with their sudden bloom. First the drogues, then the mains. Giant orange and white sails of fabric engineered to slow the descent to a survivable speed. From thousands of kilometers per hour to mere meters per second, it was a slow surrender. The sky outside turned from black to blue. The stars faded behind the soft haze of atmosphere. And in those final minutes, Neil felt the full spectrum of gravity's expression, from the fire of re-entry, to the gentle resistance of air, to the downward pull of the sea. Then, splashdown. The capsule struck the water with a thud and a bounce, then settled into bobbing, wave-licked motion. The ocean's surface, seemingly so still from above, now cradled the spacecraft like a leaf on a vast pond. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, they had stopped moving. They were no longer in orbit, no longer falling. They were simply still. The radio crackled with voices, control room, recovery team, confirmation protocols. The world outside their capsule was beginning to reconnect, slowly replacing the hush of space with the bustle of Earth. Neil unstrapped himself and tilted his head upward, feeling the familiar heaviness in his spine and shoulders. His body had recalibrated again. Gravity was no longer conceptual. It was back in his bones. He thought of all that had changed, not just within him, but in the way he now saw the universe. Gravity wasn't just a force acting downward. It was a conversation between mass and motion, between time and curvature. It was the invisible reason things happened, the invisible structure beneath every orbit, every collision, every tide and breath. The ocean rocked the capsule gently, and he let his hand rest on the side panel, feeling the rhythm of the waves. Even here gravity was at work. The moon they'd just left still pulled at these waters.
The tides were not just a mythic image, they were the literal stretching of our oceans toward a partner world. Earth's surface moved in response to that call, day in and day out. He imagined looking back at Earth from the moon again, how everything there seemed so small and yet so connected. The sun pulls Earth, Earth pulls the moon tugs the seas feed the clouds shape the rain, and the rain nourishes the trees, the people, the dreams that someday build ships to return to the moon. Gravity was not just physics, it was legacy. As the recovery team approached and the capsule was secured, Neil felt a quiet sense of return, not just to a place, but to understanding. The journey had revealed the nature of gravity in ways no textbook could. It had shown him that the universe doesn't push or shove. It curves and invites. It doesn't shout. It whispers. And those whispers were everywhere, in the dust of the moon, in the pull of falling objects, in the curve of starlight past distant planets, in the waves that now rocked their ship. The mission was complete, but the story of gravity was still unfolding, everywhere, always, without end.
The days that followed their return were filled with debriefings, data transfers, physical evaluations, and press conferences. Neil moved slowly at first, his body adjusting back to full gravity, his muscles remembering the load they were meant to carry. Earth felt heavier, not metaphorically, but literally. Each step came with effort, a weight long absent. And yet, that sensation was grounding. It reminded him that he was home. Back on solid ground, surrounded by atmosphere and noise and motion, he noticed gravity in ways he never had before. He saw it in the way trees leaned after years of wind, in how cats landed on their feet, in how skyscrapers were built with precise calculations to resist sway and stress. Everything on Earth was designed to coexist with gravity. In every object, there was a kind of quiet surrender to the planet's pull. Even architecture became a negotiation. How much weight could be supported? How high a bridge could stretch before the force of gravity made it untenable? Engineers didn't ignore gravity, they collaborated with it. He walked through the recovery center garden, feeling grass beneath his feet. Each step compacted the soil ever so slightly. Each motion left a temporary imprint. Gravity had become a dialogue he was now acutely aware of, not just in massive celestial bodies, but in the way a leaf fell from a tree, spinning slowly as air and mass conducted their silent ballet. People asked him if the moon had changed him, and the answer was yes, but not in the romantic way they often hoped for. It had given him something subtler, a lens, a recalibration of perspective. Gravity was no longer just a chapter in a physics book. It was the thread that tied together the birth of stars and the falling of rain. In lectures and interviews, he found himself choosing his words more carefully. He explained that gravity was not a force in the traditional sense. It didn't push or pull like magnetism. It guided. It bent space. And that bending, that subtle curvature, influenced how everything moved. And yet, the most fascinating thing wasn't just gravity's presence, it was its predictability. Its rules never changed. They applied equally to planets and particles. That universality was rare in nature. Human emotions, politics, biology, those were messy and complex. But gravity? It was elegant, constant, immutable. Neil returned to the lab to examine some of the samples they brought back.
He held one of the smaller lunar rocks in his gloved hands and tilted it under the light. Its surface was rough, ancient. Inside it were trapped elements unchanged for billions of years. It had never known water, never felt wind, and yet it had fallen, once long ago, into the crater where they'd found it. Even that tiny fall had been governed by gravity. Some of the samples would undergo isotopic analysis. Others would be sliced into thin sections, studied under powerful microscopes. Still others would be archived, untouched, preserved for future scientists with better tools, better questions. Time was no threat to these rocks. They had waited this long. They could wait longer. He stared at the data from the retroreflector array they'd left behind. Back on the moon, it was already bouncing lasers from Earth, helping to measure, with staggering precision, the distance between the two bodies. Each photon of light traveled across space, touched the mirror, and returned home. That simple round trip over and over again built a profile of orbital mechanics and gravitational interaction so accurate it could predict tides and eclipses centuries into the future. Neil was struck by how something so grand, a relationship between worlds, could be measured in millimeters. It was another reminder that gravity didn't need to roar. It only needed patience. The more he thought about it, the more he realized gravity wasn't just physical. It was poetic. It was the quiet reason stars clustered into galaxies, why planets nestled into orbits, why moons kept their distance but never strayed. It was restraint, not compulsion. And it applied to everything, every movement, every stillness. Back home, he stood in his backyard one evening and looked up at the night sky. The moon was there, small and bright, as if nothing had changed. But for him, everything had. He had stood on that surface. He had felt its pull. And now, from Earth, he felt its echo. Children in the neighborhood played on the sidewalk, their laughter drifting through the warm air. One tossed a ball high, and it arced perfectly, falling back into small, waiting hands. That motion, the leap, the peak, the descent, it was a dance choreographed by gravity, repeated in every corner of the world, every day, unnoticed. And that was the beauty of it. Gravity didn't ask for attention. It didn't need it. It was there in every step, every orbit, every thought that tried to understand where we belonged in the cosmos. And now, for Neil, it was impossible to ignore. Because once you've walked on another world and returned, you realize that gravity is not what keeps us down. It's what keeps us together.
In the weeks following his return, Neil found himself waking up before sunrise more often than usual. He would sit by the window, coffee in hand, watching as the early morning light stretched slowly across the landscape. There was something comforting about the inevitability of it, how the sun, 93 million miles away, lifted the day over the curve of Earth by no more than gravitational allegiance and rotation. The sunrise wasn't just beautiful. It was mathematical. The Earth rotated steadily beneath the sun's constant beam, and gravity kept the air clinging to the planet's surface, scattering light into those orange and pink hues. Even something as poetic as a sunrise was deeply rooted in physics. Gravity made it possible. It held the atmosphere, gave weight to the air, and gave shape to the time we measured. Neil found his thoughts returning often to the moon, not with longing, but with clarity. He remembered standing on its surface, looking at Earth, feeling that peculiar mix of distance and connection. The moon was no longer a romantic abstraction. It was a place, real and solid, with a gravitational field of its own, and a story told in dust and silence. He began preparing lectures again.
this time for students and colleagues eager to hear not just the science, but the experience behind it. When he spoke of gravity now, he didn't start with equations. He started with moments. The quiet fall of the feather and the hammer, the long shadows over lunar craters, the subtle way the Earth curved against the stars. He wanted them to understand that gravity wasn't simply a topic in physics. It was a language the universe used to hold itself together. In one lecture, he asked the students to imagine themselves in a spacecraft between galaxies, far from stars, planets, or moons. He told them that even there, gravity remained, not absent, just weak, that it stretched infinitely, never quite reaching zero. Every particle, every atom, still danced in relation to every other across the deepest voids. Then he showed them images from the space telescopes, galaxies spiraling, bound by invisible halos of dark matter, stars orbiting supermassive black holes at terrifying speeds, entire clusters of galaxies drifting toward unseen concentrations of mass. He spoke of gravitational lensing, how light from distant objects bent around massive ones, revealing structures otherwise invisible. Gravity, he reminded them, didn't just move matter, it moved light. And then he paused, as he often did when something too large for words needed space to breathe. Eventually, someone asked the question that always came, what is gravity really? Neil smiled gently. It's the curve, he said. It's the way mass tells space how to bend, and space tells mass how to move. It's the structure beneath the motion. It's not a thing, it's a relationship, and that makes it the most honest force we know. Outside the lecture hall, autumn was arriving. Leaves fell from the trees in spirals and arcs, each motion guided by the interplay of air resistance and gravity. He watched them through the glass, entranced by their quiet descent. There was elegance in the fall, in the inevitability of it, and yet within that inevitability there was infinite complexity. Gravity didn't rush. It waited. It shaped. It revealed. Later that evening, as he returned home, he passed by a playground. Children were swinging, rising and falling, feet pointed toward the sky, laughing into the dusk. He watched them for a moment, not as an astrophysicist, but as someone who understood what the motion meant. Each arc of the swing, each climb and drop, was a pendulum, a conversation between potential energy and kinetic energy, between motion and mass. Gravity was the third partner in that conversation, ever present, always participating, never intruding. It reminded him of the moon again, of how its orbit, too, was a pendulum on a grander scale, one side pulling, the other yielding, always in motion, never escaping. That interplay had been shaping life on Earth long before humans appeared, and it would continue long after they were gone. He looked up. The moon was visible in the early evening sky, pale and steady. People walked past it without noticing, their lives focused on the immediate. But Neil saw it differently now, not just as a satellite, but as a mirror, reflecting Earth's gravity, echoing its tides, serving as both companion and reminder. The moon didn't shine with its own light. It borrowed from the sun and gave that light shape. And in doing so, it reminded us that presence isn't always about power. It's about position, about perspective.
There were moments, late at night, when Neil would sit outside with no particular intention, just to be under the sky again. The hum of the city faded in the background, and above him the constellations returned, season by season, patient as ever. He could name them all: Orion with his belt, the Great Bear, the faint blur of Andromeda. But he wasn't looking for names. He was listening for the story behind them. And the story always began with gravity. The stars, after all, were born not from light, but from collapse. In the beginning, clouds of gas and dust floated, spread thin across vast regions of space. No shape, no fire, just potential. But gravity, slow and tireless, pulled them inward, mass collecting more mass, deepening the curve of space, tightening the web. Over time, compression created heat, and heat ignited fusion. A star was born. He would often remind his students of this, that every sunrise is the result of a collapse, that the light warming their faces in the morning began as a gathering in the dark, that gravity, with no voice and no edges, was the unseen midwife of energy and time. Even black holes, those mysterious endpoints of gravitational collapse, obey the rules. They are not chaotic, they are elegant, predictable. Their mass, spin, and charge define their character completely. Nothing more, nothing less. They are extreme, but they are honest. Neil found it poetic that gravity, the force responsible for the birth of stars, was also what could kill their light. Too much mass, too much collapse, and even photons would lose the battle. Not because they lacked energy, but because space itself had turned inward. The horizon of no return was not a wall, it was a slope so steep that motion ceased to be meaningful. And yet, he reminded himself that black holes were not empty. They were full of questions, perhaps even answers. They were not the end of gravity. They were its most intense expression, its cathedral. He would sometimes lie back on the grass and close his eyes, not to sleep, but to sense, to feel the weight of his body pressing into the earth. It was a subtle thing, often forgotten, but now it was intimate. The pressure in his bones, the heaviness in his chest, wasn't discomfort, it was connection. He was being held. The earth didn't pull because it wanted to claim him. It pulled because it had mass, because that's what mass does. And in doing so, it gave him a place, a frame, a here. He thought of the moon again, in orbit, not tethered by chains, but by motion. Its path was graceful because it was in balance. Too fast, and it would drift away. Too slow, and it would fall. But in its current dance, it remained, locked in a perfect compromise between moving forward and falling inward. That's what orbit really is. People often imagined gravity as a kind of invisible rope, but Neil knew it wasn't that. It was more subtle, more intricate. You didn't need a rope to stay near something. You needed motion that matched the curve of space, like a marble on a bowl's rim. Tip it too much, and it slides in. Push it just right, and it circles the edge forever. He considered how Earth itself moved, not just rotating on its axis, but orbiting the Sun, which orbited the galactic center, which itself drifted through the cosmic web. Nothing was still, nothing was separate. Every gravitational interaction was part of a greater choreography. He had learned through his journey that understanding gravity meant letting go of certainty. You couldn't feel its edges or trace its lines.
You had to observe its effects: a falling apple, a rising tide, a crater on the moon, a shift in a satellite's path. All of these were messages. Gravity spoke in effects. And more than that, it was democratic. It didn't care if the object was massive or minute. If it had mass, it had meaning. Every grain of sand curved space, even if imperceptibly. Every body, no matter how small, was heard by gravity. That thought gave Neil a kind of comfort, that the universe paid attention to everything, that nothing, in the eyes of gravity, was too small to matter, that we, fragile beings on a rocky planet circling a medium-sized star, were part of that same story. We didn't just exist in gravity, we were written by it.
He often thought about how fragile things could still be bound by the strongest principles. Gravity didn't need to make noise to shape a planet, didn't need to announce itself to hold galaxies in formation. It didn't ask to be worshipped, but in its quiet permanence, it earned a kind of reverence. Neil recalled how he used to think of gravity as merely downward, a force that pinned you in place, but now he saw it everywhere, in the elegant motion of comets arcing through the solar system, in the shape of Saturn's rings, in the elongated paths of rogue planets tossed from their stars but still tethered to the galaxy. He realized that gravity didn't confine, it choreographed. Even now in the lab, he could trace gravity's hand in everything, in the trajectories of particles in a vacuum chamber, in the settling of dust on a steel surface, in the very way light bent around a heavy object. He would run simulations showing the behavior of two stars orbiting one another, spiraling ever closer as they emitted gravitational waves, ripples in space-time itself, predicted by Einstein and confirmed only recently. That discovery had shaken the foundations of physics, not because it contradicted what was known, but because it confirmed the unimaginable, that space-time could ripple, that events billions of years ago could send a tremor through the universe, detectable here, now, by delicate instruments measuring distortions smaller than a proton. And what caused those waves? Gravity, not as a static thing, but as a dynamic fabric. He would explain it like this: if space were a trampoline, mass was the bowling ball, but not a still ball, one that danced and collided, stretching and compressing the trampoline with every beat. The universe wasn't just held together, it was alive with motion. He smiled at the thought of gravity being alive, not in a literal sense, but in its persistence, its responsiveness. Wherever there was mass, gravity was listening. Wherever there was motion, it was recording. He remembered standing in a museum, looking at a meteoroid displayed behind thick glass. The tag below it said it was 4.5 billion years old, a rock older than Earth's oceans. It had once been part of a larger body, then broken free, sent drifting, captured by the Earth's pull, and drawn down through the atmosphere. It had survived heat, time, and chance, because gravity never stopped acting on it. Holding that memory, he looked now at his own hand. Bones and muscles, cells and blood, all of it assembled through generations of evolution, shaped in a world where gravity was constant. Our anatomy was not just biology, it was adaptation to a field we never escaped. Our legs developed to resist gravity, our lungs to fill despite it, our hearts to pump upward against its pull. Even our dreams, he thought, had been shaped by the idea of leaving gravity behind. But we never really do. Even the astronauts on the International Space Station are still under the influence of Earth's gravity. They're not beyond it. They're simply falling fast enough sideways to stay in perpetual freefall. That's what orbit is, not escape, not floating, a controlled fall, a surrender in motion. It made him wonder if gravity was not just the architecture of the universe, but the backdrop of consciousness. We learn to walk not just with muscles, but by learning to balance within a gravitational frame. We feel safe when we're grounded. We fear falling. Even our metaphors betray our dependency. Gravity of the situation, falling apart, uplifted. These phrases are not just poetic. They're echoes of a physical truth embedded in thought. And then, sometimes, he would take that thought further. What if gravity wasn't simply a property of mass, but a kind of conversation between matter and the universe? What if it was the price we paid for having mass at all? That to exist, to have substance, was to bend the space you occupied? And if so, was that bending a kind of memory? Was the universe remembering us through curves? These questions didn't demand answers. They were the kind of thoughts that drifted into the quiet between explanations, the kind that came when the lectures ended, when the telescopes powered down, when the room was dark and the stars reappeared. That was when he most felt gravity's presence, not as a law, but as a reminder that we are part of something vast, not separate, not above it, held, always held.
It was a quiet evening when Neil found himself revisiting an old observatory. The dome above him, once bustling with activity and chatter, now stood in solemn stillness, housing a telescope that had spent decades tracing the heavens. He moved slowly through the space, running his fingers along the cold metal casing of the instrument, feeling the layers of time embedded in its form. How many times had this telescope turned its eye toward Jupiter, Saturn, or distant galaxies? How many stories had gravity helped reveal through its lens? He remembered the first time he looked through a telescope as a child. The moon had seemed close enough to touch, its surface detailed and luminous, every crater a mystery. Back then, he hadn't yet understood that gravity had shaped each of those craters, had pulled every meteor down with precision, had dictated every arc and impact for billions of years. But he had felt awe, and that awe had never left him. Now, decades later, the moon no longer felt distant. He had walked on it, left footprints in its dust, felt its lesser pull. And yet, in that moment, it wasn't the moon's gravity that held his attention. It was Earth's, the force that had brought him back, that had waited for him, that had never stopped pulling. He sat down beside the telescope and looked out through the slit in the dome, where the sky poured in like ink. Above, constellations shimmered. He traced their paths with his eyes, imagining the vast gravitational fields at work behind the scenes, stars spinning, planets orbiting, entire galaxies colliding slowly, silently, on scales that dwarfed comprehension. There was something deeply human about trying to find patterns in the stars, drawing lines between lights, telling stories, naming the shapes. And yet, those stars were not fixed. They moved, obeying laws set in motion at the dawn of time. Even the North Star would shift over millennia, pulled by the precession of Earth's axis, a dance dictated by gravity's quiet grip. He thought of Voyager, the small spacecraft launched decades ago, still drifting outward, now beyond the reach of our sun's dominant gravity, carried by momentum into the interstellar dark.
Even out there, gravity hadn't disappeared. It was simply spread thinner. Every star, every speck of dust, still curved space, still listened, still responded. It was humbling to realize how much we owe to gravity's consistency. The stable orbits that allowed life to flourish on Earth, the protective layers of atmosphere held in place, the delicate balance between centrifugal force and gravitational force that keeps satellites circling our world. Even the fragile stability of our own posture, the unconscious correction of balance when we walk, was a testament to our lifelong dialogue with gravity. Neil rose from his seat and walked slowly out into the open air. The sky stretched above him in silence, the earth beneath his feet firm, unwavering. He could feel the pull in every step, not as a burden, but as grounding, as presence. Somewhere in a classroom, he imagined, a young student was looking up at the night sky for the first time, wondering how stars stayed in place, why planets moved, what held the moon in its path. He hoped they would come to understand not just the equations, but the wonder. That behind every falling apple, behind every orbit, behind the very shape of time itself, was a force that did not shout. It simply was. That was gravity's power. He smiled, thinking back to the moon, to the silence, to the long journey home. He remembered how small Earth looked from up there, delicate, suspended, beautiful, and yet it had called to them. It had guided their trajectory. It had waited with absolute certainty, never doubting, never forgetting. That was the lesson he wished more people could feel, not just understand, but feel, that gravity was not something to escape. It was something to work with, to respect. It gave shape to every movement, purpose to every fall, and continuity to existence itself. As he stood under the stars, the dome behind him, and the earth beneath his feet, he felt again that deep truth he had carried back from space. We are not held down by gravity. We are held within it.
There came a day when Neil was asked to speak at a school, a modest building with wide hallways and walls covered in posters about the solar system. As he stepped into the auditorium, filled with curious faces, he was struck by how young most of them were. Children still learning multiplication, still drawing pictures of rockets and planets, still looking up with questions instead of assumptions. He looked at them not as students, but as future explorers. Some of them would one day contribute to the science he had helped shape. Some might build the next telescopes. Some might walk farther than he ever had. But all of them were already living under the same gravitational truth as the rest of the universe. It bound them, guided them, protected them, even if they hadn't noticed it yet. He began by asking them a simple question. Have you ever jumped? Dozens of hands flew up. Have you ever wondered why you come back down? More hands, a few laughs. One small voice said, because the earth won't let us go. Neil smiled. That was it. That was gravity. The earth holding us, not possessively, but reliably. And not just holding us down, but holding us together. He told them how, on the moon, everything feels lighter, how your steps become bounds, how your sense of effort changes. But he also told them that even on the moon, gravity is still there, just gentler, still shaping, still guiding. The moon isn't a place where gravity is absent. It's a place where it whispers instead of speaks.
He could see in their eyes the spark of imagination flicker, tiny astronauts forming in thought. He reminded them that gravity doesn't just work on big things, that even the pencil they dropped curved space around it, ever so slightly, that they, sitting in their seats, were part of the same gravitational network that choreographed the planets, that they mattered in the equation. After the talk, a young girl came up and asked, "If gravity pulls everything together, why don't all the stars just crash into each other?" It was the kind of question that revealed a mind paying attention. Neil knelt beside her and answered slowly, "Because stars, like people, move. They don't sit still. And gravity doesn't want everything in one place. It just wants everything to know it's connected. So it lets stars dance, orbit, drift, always influenced, never abandoned." She nodded thoughtfully and walked away. Later that evening, Neil sat by a window overlooking the schoolyard. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the grass where the children had played. He thought about how even now, gravity was busy, pulling the oceans toward the moon, pulling the moon toward Earth, pulling Earth toward the sun, and the sun toward the galactic center. And none of it made a sound. There were no gears turning, no engines humming, no levers shifting, just space curved, just time shaped, just mass existing and being acknowledged. He wondered how many more questions gravity could answer if we knew how to listen properly. How many secrets of the universe were not hidden, but simply misunderstood, because we expected gravity to behave like fire or wind, when in fact it was more like memory, persistent, quiet, structural. He thought of how the galaxies spun, how their outer edges rotated too fast to be explained by visible matter alone. That discrepancy had led to the concept of dark matter, invisible mass still responding to gravity, still curving space, still whispering in equations we hadn't yet solved. Gravity was showing us what we couldn't see, not by what was there, but by how things moved around it. That, too, was a lesson worth teaching. He finished his notes for the next day's lecture, folded them into a thin folder, and leaned back. He wasn't preparing to explain formulas. He was preparing to open a door, to help someone see gravity not as a constraint, but as a language the universe never stopped speaking. And the more we listened, the more we understood that gravity wasn't about weight. It was about connection, between rocks and stars, between footsteps and orbits, between questions and awe. Because in the end, gravity wasn't pulling things down. It was pulling everything together.
Back at home, Neil sometimes found himself tracing imaginary paths in the sky. His eyes would follow the arc of a satellite crossing overhead, its slow, steady glide a product of perfect velocity and gravitational harmony. It wasn't flapping wings or fuel propelling it. It was falling forever. Falling sideways around the Earth in a way that never quite reached the ground. That's what made orbits so deceptively simple. They were a product of surrender. A spacecraft didn't resist gravity. It embraced it, allowed it to shape the path, to define the balance. And if the velocity was right, that balance lasted for years, decades, or longer. As long as gravity was there, and it always was, motion could become poetry. Neil often thought about how we used gravity without even thinking. Roller coasters, pendulums, water slides, even musical instruments. A falling string, a plucked note. Gravity affected tension, resonance, vibration. Without gravity, a cello wouldn't sound the same. Even something as gentle as a lullaby had gravity in its bones. He imagined civilizations on other planets, beings shaped by a different gravitational constant, bones denser or lighter, movement slower or more springy, all determined by the pull of their world. Would they feel their gravity as home the way we did? Would they dream of leaving it behind? Or would they, like us, eventually realize that escape isn't liberation, it's a loop, a return, a reminder? He sometimes remembered how astronauts described coming back to Earth as a strange rebirth, the first shower, the first step onto grass, the way their legs ached for carrying their weight again. Gravity became intimate after absence, like a friend who says nothing but is always there. The word gravity, he reflected, came from the Latin gravitas, seriousness, dignity, importance. Maybe that etymology wasn't accidental, because gravity didn't just weigh us physically, it lent weight to things metaphorically. We spoke of the gravity of a moment, or the gravity of a decision, as if our language understood something deep even before our physics caught up. And there was a kind of dignity in it, wasn't there? Gravity never rushed, it never forced. It curved, invited, responded. It gave mass a reason to stay close. It gave time a direction. It gave space a texture. In a way, gravity was time's partner. Without it, time would lose its structure. Mass creates gravity. Gravity bends space, and bent space changes how time flows. A clock on a mountain ticks faster than one at sea level, not by much, but measurably. The farther you are from a gravitational well, the quicker time unfolds. Even time listens to gravity. That idea fascinated Neil, that we age differently depending on our altitude, that two twins separated only by height or orbital speed could measure different spans of time, that black holes with their monstrous mass could slow time near them almost to a stop, not by magic, but by gravity. He used to think of gravity as something that only pulled objects, but now he saw it as something that pulled reality itself. And maybe, just maybe, that's what made gravity so profound. It wasn't flashy, it didn't need light or sound, but it shaped everything, from the dust in a comet's tail to the arc of a life lived on Earth. It shaped dreams. It shaped memory. It shaped the moon's patient orbit and the tides that answered it like a breath. And it shaped the question that Neil found himself asking more and more. What else has gravity already told us, quietly, gently, that we've yet to hear? He stood once more beneath the stars, listening not with his ears, but with awareness, with stillness, with respect. And though the stars gave no reply, their silence was curved by gravity. And in that curvature, there was an answer.
It was during one of those long, silent walks beneath the evening sky that Neil began to reflect on the future of gravity.
not just its role in understanding the cosmos, but how it would shape our journey beyond this planet. Gravity wasn't something we could escape, but it was something we would learn to work around, to bend to our purpose, to simulate, to live with in new ways. He thought of Mars, not just as a dot in the sky, but as a world with its own gravity, lighter than Earth's, but not absent, enough to pull a dropped wrench to the ground, enough to sculpt mountains and valleys over eons, enough to give direction to a fall and resistance to a step. One day people would live there, and gravity would shape them just as it had shaped humanity on Earth. Their bones would adapt, their muscles would recondition. Children born under the soft pull of Mars might grow taller, lighter, move differently. Even their hearts would beat to a slightly altered rhythm, not broken, just retuned. He thought of future astronauts training in centrifuges, simulating Martian gravity or lunar gravity, adjusting to fractional weights and artificial spins. Gravity, once a passive backdrop, would become an active ingredient in design of habitats, routines, bodies, even culture. Perhaps someday gravity itself would be engineered, not conquered, but crafted. Already scientists had imagined vast rotating space stations creating centrifugal gravity by spinning. Not true gravity, of course, no warping of space-time, just motion mimicking its pull. But would that distinction matter to the people living there? Maybe gravity in time would become a choice. But Neil knew better to believe we could ever sever ourselves from its influence. Because even in a future of artificial habitats and zero-gravity voyages, the fundamental truth remained. Gravity is the shape of space, and we live within that shape. Even when we think we've escaped it, we're still inside its design. And then he thought of gravity's role not just in science, but in emotion. How we say we feel grounded when calm. How we speak of being swept off our feet in moments of joy or chaos. How loss feels like falling, and love like an anchor. The metaphors weren't accidents. They were reflections of something real. Our lives measured against gravity's invisible field. Our language, our gestures, our very sense of balance were molded by it. We trusted it instinctively. Babies cried when they fell, not just from pain, but from betrayal of that trust. Gravity had always been there, until, suddenly, it wasn't. Neil remembered a moment on the moon when he tripped slightly, just a misstep, a clumsy bounce off a small rise in the surface, and for a split second he floated higher than he expected. There was no danger, but it startled him. It reminded him how finely tuned he had become to Earth's rhythm, and how quickly absence changes everything. In that brief drift, he saw the truth. We are built for gravity. Every cell in our bodies, every instinct in our minds, and when it changes, even gently, we change too. That's why gravity would always be part of space travel, not just because it shaped orbits and trajectories, but because it shaped us. Every voyage into space was a voyage into a new gravitational relationship, and we had to learn how to listen again, how to walk again, how to belong again. He imagined a future explorer standing on Europa, watching distant Jupiter dominate the sky, feeling only a fraction of Earth's pull beneath their feet.
How strange it would feel. How beautiful. How disorienting. But still, gravity would be there. Fainter maybe, but unmistakable. And it would still whisper the same truths. That motion has meaning. That distance has consequence. That even in the vast silence of the void, we are never completely untethered. We are always part of something larger, always pulled. Sometimes, in quiet moments between interviews or lectures, Neil would return to the raw equations of gravity. The Einstein field equations, those dense symbols stitched together like a tapestry of space and time, still held power for him, not just as tools, but as poetry. Because hidden in those lines was everything. How mass bends the universe. How energy curves the path of light. How motion alters time itself. He'd long since memorized them, of course, but reciting them wasn't the point. The point was feeling what they meant. A single tensor term could explain the path of a planet. A subtle derivative could predict how a clock would tick on the edge of a black hole. That's what gravity offered. Not chaos, but clarity. Not magic, but magnificence wrapped in math. And yet, the most important part of understanding gravity wasn't in numbers or graphs. It was in recognizing its constancy, its generosity, its reach. Even in the vacuum of space where nothing visible stirred, gravity was at work, stretching, warping, balancing. The absence of air didn't mean the absence of influence. Gravity was never still. It was simply everywhere. He reflected on how human civilization had evolved with gravity as a silent partner, from building pyramids to launching rockets, from balancing stones to aligning telescopes. Every advancement had been shaped by our unspoken dialogue with it. And the farther we reached, from orbit to moon, from moon to Mars, from Mars to beyond, the more we came to appreciate that dialogue. Neil thought about the missions yet to come. Robotic explorers mapping the icy surface of Enceladus, telescopes set to orbit in gravitational harmony with Earth, even interstellar probes being dreamed into blueprints. Every one of them would rely on gravity, not just as an obstacle to overcome, but as an ally. A well-placed gravity assist, for example, slingshotting a spacecraft around a planet, could save years of travel time. It wasn't cheating, it was collaboration. The spacecraft didn't fight the planet's pull, it used it, gracefully, intelligently. Just like a surfer riding a wave, not overpowering it, but flowing with it. That was the new way of thinking Neil hoped the next generation would adopt. Not dominance over nature, but partnership. Gravity didn't need to be conquered, it needed to be understood. He once described gravity as the great equalizer, because it acts on all mass the same way. A gold coin and a feather, in a vacuum, fall at the same rate. The universe doesn't care about status, wealth, or origin. It cares about mass. It cares about position. It cares about motion. In a way, gravity was the fairest force we knew. He imagined a classroom 100 years from now, on a space station orbiting Titan, or on a moon base tucked into a lava tube. There, children would grow up with different expectations of gravity. Maybe they'd measure it in different ways. Maybe their books would describe the moon not as a dream, but as history, a first step. Would they still look up?
Would they still wonder? He hoped so, because no matter how far we traveled, no matter how light or heavy our surroundings became, the story would remain the same. Gravity would still be shaping our path, still guiding our return, still keeping us tethered, not to a planet, but to each other, to the truth of things. In the dark, in the silence, in the vast reaches between stars, gravity was the one thing that never stopped speaking. Its voice was soft, but its message was clear.
There's something sacred about returning, not just to a place, but to an understanding, to a memory, a feeling, a truth you didn't know you'd forgotten. For Neil, that truth always brought him back to gravity, not as a theory or force, but as a presence. It was there when he first looked through a telescope. It was there when he stepped onto the moon. And it was there, quietly, when he touched Earth again. The journey had changed him, not because of what he left behind, but because of what he saw from the outside. Earth, floating in the vast dark, surrounded by silence, and yet alive with pull. It was gravity that made Earth more than a rock. It made it home. Sometimes he would close his eyes and remember what it felt like to look at Earth from the moon. The curvature, the fragility, the light scattered across clouds and ocean. And in that moment, gravity no longer felt like something pulling him downward. It felt like something calling him back. Not with force, with familiarity. That was the paradox. We often spoke of gravity as limitation, a boundary to break, a chain to snap. But those who left Earth knew better. They knew that gravity was not a prison, it was a promise. It promised return. It promised continuity. It promised that even in a universe as wild and expanding as ours, there would always be something pulling us toward connection. Neil would sometimes trace his finger across star charts, feeling not just distance, but relationship. A distant pulsar, its beam flickering. A binary system locked in endless spiral. A planet discovered by the tiny wobble it caused in its star. All of them stories told through gravity. All of them conversations in motion. The farther science reached, the deeper gravity's fingerprints became. Black holes speaking in gravitational waves. Galaxies bound by dark matter. The early universe, dense and hot, governed by the same curve we feel under our feet. And maybe that was the lesson gravity had always been trying to teach. That no mass exists in isolation. That everything pulls on everything. That connection is not weakness, but the foundation of everything that moves, breathes, or dreams. He often ended his talks now not with answers, but with a pause, an invitation to feel what numbers could not describe, to sense what gravity meant, not in units or meters per second squared, but in belonging. Because gravity isn't just what makes an apple fall, it's what makes us return to the ground, to each other, to ourselves. As he looked once more into the sky, into the infinite curves and arcs of possibility, Neil knew there were more journeys to come, more questions, more paths shaped by gravity's invisible hand. But wherever we go, however far, one truth remains. The universe does not hold us back. It holds us close.